The average working cowboy in the 1870s made about $1 a day. He worked 16 hours in it. He ate the same meal 3 times. He slept on the ground. He didn't own a horse. The ranch did. He didn't carry a revolver. He couldn't afford one. And almost everything you think you know about cowboys comes from a novel published in 1902 by a man named Owen Wister, who grew up in Philadelphia, studied music at Harvard, and never spent a working day on a cattle ranch in his life. The novel was called The Virginian. It sold over 1 million copies. It invented the cowboy as America wanted him to be. And it had almost nothing to do with the cowboy as he actually was. That gap between the version you've been sold and the version that was real is what this video is about. Let's start with the money, because the money tells you everything. $1 a day. In the 1870s, that was roughly equivalent to $30 or $40 in today's terms. Out of that dollar, the cowboy paid for his own clothing, his own boots, his own hat, his own bedroll, and any personal supplies he needed on the trail. The ranch provided the horse and the saddle, and owned both. If a cowboy lost or injured the horse, the cost came out of his wages. If the saddle was damaged, the cost came out of his wages. The economics of the arrangement were straightforward. The cowboy was labor. He was not a partner, not an owner, not a frontiersman carving out his destiny. He was a hired hand on a horse that belonged to someone else, doing a job that most ranchers considered roughly equivalent to farm work, which, in fact, it was. The romance was added later. The gun is worth its own paragraph, because the gun is where the myth falls apart fastest. In the Hollywood version, every cowboy carries a Colt revolver on his hip, quick draw ready, loaded, essential. In reality, a Colt single-action Army revolver cost about $17 in the 1870s. That was 2.5 weeks' wages. Think about that for a second. Imagine spending 2.5 weeks of your paycheck on a single item you had almost no practical use for. Most working cowboys could not afford one and did not carry one. The ranch sometimes provided a rifle, a shared weapon, kept with the camp supplies, used for predators threatening the herd. But the sidearm, the iconic revolver, the symbol of the cowboy, most working cowboys never owned one. They carried a rope. They carried a knife. The gun was for movies. The rope was for work. Now the actual day. A working cowboy on a cattle drive woke up around 4 in the morning. Not by choice. The cook, who was often the highest paid man on the drive, because without him nobody ate, started the fire before dawn. Breakfast was coffee, biscuits, and beans. Sometimes salt pork if the supply was recent. The coffee was boiled in an open pot with grounds thrown directly into the water. No filter, no press. It was strong enough that contemporary accounts describe it as thick. Breakfast took about 20 minutes. Then the work began. The work was cattle. Moving cattle, watching cattle, chasing cattle that had broken from the herd. The average cattle drive covered about 10 to 15 miles a day, slow enough for the animals to graze as they walked, fast enough to stay on schedule for the railhead market. A herd of 2,000 to 3,000 longhorns required about 10 to 12 cowboys, working in shifts. The lead riders set the pace. The flank riders kept the herd together. The drag riders, the worst job, always given to the newest hands, rode at the back of the herd, eating the dust kicked up by 3,000 animals walking across dry prairie. That dust was constant. It filled the nose, the mouth, the eyes. Bandanas were not fashion. They were survival equipment. A drag rider in the summer could expect to breathe cattle dust for 12 hours straight. By the end of the day, the inside of the nose was black. Lunch was the same as breakfast: coffee, biscuits, beans. If the cook had dried beef, jerky, or its less appetizing ancestor, that was added. The meal happened at the midday stop, when the herd was allowed to rest and graze. The cowboys ate fast because the herd needed watching even at rest. Cattle are not intelligent animals. They are easily spooked. A thunderclap, a snake, a sudden movement could trigger a stampede. 2,000 or 3,000 panicked animals running in the same direction at full speed. Stampedes killed cowboys. Not frequently, but regularly enough that every hand on the drive understood the risk. There was no warning. The herd would be still, and then would not be. And the next 60 seconds determined who lived and who didn't. A horse could outrun a stampede if you reacted fast enough. If you didn't, or if the horse stumbled, the result was a man under several thousand hooves on open ground with no cover. There were no ambulances. There was no hospital within 100 miles. There was the cook who might know how to set a bone. Might. Dinner was the same as lunch: coffee, biscuits, beans. Occasionally, if the drive passed through an area with game, fresh meat. But the diet was fundamentally monotonous, nutritionally marginal, and prepared under conditions that would not pass any inspection at any point in the last century. The cook worked from the chuck wagon, a modified cart carrying flour, coffee, sugar, dried beans, salt pork, and cooking equipment. There was no refrigeration. In the summer heat of Texas, Kansas, or the Indian Territory, food spoiled fast. The beans were often sour by the third day. The biscuits were made with flour that had been opened to dust and insects for weeks. The coffee was the one reliable comfort, and it was the one thing nobody complained about, because complaining about the food was considered bad form on a drive. The cook could and would serve worse. The water situation was its own problem. A cattle drive followed river routes whenever possible, because 3,000 longhorns drank enormous quantities of water every day. But the rivers of the southern plains were not reliable. Some ran dry in summer. Some were alkaline, water that looked clear but carried enough mineral salts to cause violent cramps in both cattle and men. A trail boss who chose a bad route, one with dry stretches or poisoned water, could lose animals by the hundreds and cowboys to dehydration and dysentery. There was no map that marked which water sources were safe in which season. There was experience, passed from one drive to the next by word of mouth. And sometimes the experience was wrong, because a spring that ran clean last year had dried up this year. And now you were 30 miles from the next water with a herd that was starting to scatter. Here's the part that the movies skip entirely. The #1 killer of cowboys was not a gunfight. It was not a stampede. It was not a rattlesnake. It was pneumonia. Sleeping on the ground, in the open, on wet earth, in clothing that never fully dried, for months at a time. The cowboy carried one bedroll, a canvas tarp, and a wool blanket. That was your shelter. There was no tent. If it rained, the cowboy got wet. If it was cold and the northern plains dropped below freezing routinely in autumn, the cowboy slept cold. Night watch made it worse. 2-hour shifts, riding slowly around the herd in the dark, often in wind and rain, then trying to sleep in damp clothing on damp ground for 4 hours before the next shift. Pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis. These were the killers. Quiet, unglamorous, and completely absent from every Western ever made. A cowboy with a persistent cough in October had a meaningful chance of being dead by December. And there was nothing anyone on the trail could do about it. The injuries were the other reality the myth erases. A working cowboy handled animals that weighed 1,000 pounds or more, on a horse moving at speed using a rope. If you've never tried to hold a rope attached to a running longhorn steer from the back of a moving horse, the physics might not seem obvious, but the forces involved were enormous. Dislocated shoulders from roping, broken ribs from being thrown, crushed legs from horses falling, hernias from lifting. One survey of cowboy graves from the 1870s and 80s found that the most common cause of death after illness was horse-related accident, a category that covered everything from being dragged to being rolled on. There was no workers' compensation. There was no sick leave. A cowboy too injured to work was left at the nearest town with whatever wages he was owed. If he recovered, he might find another drive. If he didn't, he was on his own. The cattle industry did not have a pension plan. There is another erasure worth noting because it tells the same story from a different angle. The working cowboy population was not what Hollywood shows. Roughly 1 in 4 cowboys during the peak era was black or Mexican. Some were formerly enslaved men who found cattle work after the Civil War, one of the few occupations open to them that paid anything close to equal wages. Some were vaqueros, Mexican horsemen whose ranching traditions predated the Anglo cattle industry by centuries. The word buckaroo is an English corruption of vaquero. The lasso, the roundup, the branding techniques, the cattle handling methods, most of what defined cowboy work was adapted from Mexican practice. The Anglo cowboy learned the job from the vaquero, took the credit, and wrote the vaquero out of the story. Owen Wister's Virginian is white. Every hero in every Western is white. The historical record tells a different story, one where a significant portion of the men doing the actual work looked nothing like the men Hollywood later cast to play them. And yet, and this is the part that earns something closer to respect than pity, about 50,000 men were working as cowboys at the peak of the era, roughly 1866 to 1886. 20 years, $1 a day. No horse of their own, no gun, beans for every meal, sleeping on the ground, pneumonia as a realistic occupational hazard. And they signed up, voluntarily. Every spring, the ranches posted hiring notices, and men showed up. Some were ex-Confederate soldiers with no other prospects. Some were teenagers looking for work that would take them away from failing farms. The reasons were varied. The conditions were not. Everyone got the same dollar. Everyone slept on the same ground. And the mythology, the Stetson, the six-shooter, the lone rider against the sunset, would be added decades later by people who had never been there. Owen Wister published The Virginian in 1902. He had visited Wyoming several times as a tourist, staying at guest ranches, on a doctor's recommendation for his health. He was fascinated by the West the way a visitor to a foreign country is fascinated, from the outside, with admiration and selective attention. The Virginian was the first Western novel. It gave America the strong, silent-type cowboy, the showdown at high noon, the love story on the frontier. It was fiction, and it was so successful that it rewrote the popular understanding of an entire profession. Within a decade, the cowboy of the Virginian, noble, independent, armed, free, had replaced the actual cowboy in the national imagination. The actual cowboy made $1 a day and slept in the mud. The fictional cowboy rode into the sunset. America chose the fictional version. And if you grew up watching westerns, or playing cowboys, or believing that the frontier was a place of freedom and self-reliance, that choice is still shaping what you think you know. Here's what sits with me about the real cowboy. Not the myth, not the movie. The actual man on the actual horse. He knew what the job was. By the second week of any drive, every illusion was gone. The dust was real. The food was real. The wet bedroll and the 2-hour night watch in the rain were real. The pay was openly, obviously insufficient. And he stayed. Not because he was trapped. Most cowboys could have walked to the nearest town and found different work. Not because he was brave. Bravery implies a choice made against fear. And most of the job was not frightening. It was just grinding. He stayed because the work was there, and the alternative was uncertain. And the open country, even uncomfortable, even exhausting, even dangerous, was at least not a factory floor or a failing farm. The real cowboy was not a hero and was not a victim. He was a man doing a job that the rest of the country would later decide to remember as something it never was. Last time, we left medieval England and the world's worst menu. This time, we've been in the American 1800s, and the food was better, but everything else was worse. Next time, we're going back. 600 years before the cowboys, there was an England so dark that even the historians who study it call it the Dark Ages. 900 AD. A country living inside the ruins of a civilization it couldn't rebuild. And the name turns out to be wrong. That's next.